Hey GBDev, so I just wanted to give a quick update and answer some of your guys' questions. The good news is that everything is still working, so I made a lot of progress tonight and I will show you my progress. So I did get the title screen working, so those tiles are loading in and the map is loading in fine in that third bank. And you hit start, and now the game will actually progress when you clear all the windows. And when you do so, he'll climb up the tower, it'll scroll down, and you can continue. So I'm pretty happy about that. Everything is still working so far, and that is because, like I mentioned in the last video, getting my build file to work correctly with the correct bank controller really helps. So let's look at some of these responses. So Jonah says, and oh, this was fantastic to learn. I completely screwed this up, so thank you so much for telling me this. In my build file, I thought that this meant I'm using Memory Bank Controller 5, and I was completely wrong about that. If I follow your link, and it says what I actually would have wanted was Memory Bank Controller 5 plus RAM, not 5, I would have wanted 1A. And instead I was just using Memory Bank Controller 2. So that explains a lot. Thank you very much, Jonas, for that. I will get back to this point in a second. And yes, I'm not using RAM right now, so that's good. But in the future, I might need to, so that's why I'm still trying to understand this. Because maybe not with this game, but in a future game, I might need multiple RAM banks, and so I'd really like to understand it so I don't get stuck, while we're on the topic at least. And right, I'm going to skip Tobias for a second and go down to ISO. So this was something I didn't know at all. I understood the concept of SRAM, but I always thought it was like a particular bank or something like that, and it would be mixed in with the other banks. I didn't really realize that, like you said, on the Color Game Boy, the WRAM banks are completely independent from the ROM, and any cartridge could have SRAM or save RAM. So in this case, I'm talking about WRAM, and I had no idea that those were, independent things, and I thought that the controller would basically just pick one or the other. Whether it was RAM or ROM, and I didn't really realize that distinction. So thank you very much, ISO. There is a lot of confusion, mostly because I'm very confused. So I'm starting to piece it together, though, so thank you. And on that note, going back to Tobias, you were saying, the more ROM banks you use, the fewer RAM banks you can use, and vice versa. I had no idea. I completely thought that it was the max of both at the same time, but apparently it's not the max. So that's also very good to know. So you guys right there really helped me a lot to try to understand that. But then when you're saying you don't understand what I was asking around 7:30, well, I don't blame you because I barely understand what I'm asking. So I'll try to, I think I have a better way to explain it, and hopefully you'll be able to help me out a little bit more here. So normally when you think about like RAM in a machine, you don't think about where a variable is going to go. You kind of let that happen automatically for you, at least when you're programming in C. Now, I don't know much about assembly, so maybe it's different if you're working in assembly, but when you think about C, you might say something like this, right? And then when this is compiled, it's going to tell, in the machine code, like, okay, you're going to have to put aside some memory for foo. And then when your code starts running, it's going to say, okay, put the value 5 in the memory location where foo is. So that all makes sense, but it's kind of abstracted from you, right? So in this particular case, what bank is it going into? If I were to, for example, say, or it's like that, is foo now suddenly in a different bit of RAM? Is that how that works? That's why I'm a little bit confused about how the RAM banks work, because normally you don't think about where in RAM something goes, and you don't think about how that's going to be defined. Is it actually something like this? Like maybe this won't work because this is already declared out here. So maybe I should switch to the bank and then say that, and then now that will only exist in that particular bank, right? Is that how that works? I'm a little confused about how the RAM works. And then the other thing is, for example, you could maybe say something like this, where I'm saying I want a pointer to this particular location in RAM. And in this case, this makes sense to me, right? Instead of this, we could say dereference it and say, no, I already have it, right? That makes sense to me because now I'm saying I've switched to this bank and I want this particular location and I want it to be that value. So maybe that's how you're supposed to use banks. Maybe I'm just overthinking how RAM banks work. So that's why I was a little bit confused about banks, because I don't really understand with a ROM, for instance, right? This makes perfect sense to me. I have some code. It's going to be compiled into machine code, and then it's going to be stored in this particular bank. That makes perfect sense to me. And when I want to run a function from that bank, I would switch to that bank, and then the function will be at the correct address for the machine code in that bank, and it will be able to execute. So that makes perfect sense to me. It makes sense to put, compiled executable machine code into banks of ROM. I like that idea. That I get. And then, linking them together, into one image, so that LCC, can say like, okay, well, when you switch banks, you're going to have all of these, endpoints, all these functions at these locations. It's going to be the same address space, but they're going to work. I like that. I get that. That makes sense to me. What doesn't make sense to me is how RAM comes into the LCC compiling picture. And I know you said, Tobias, that you're not familiar with GBDK. So, you probably can't help me with this, but maybe you can help me understand in a more generic term from the assembly side of things. So this was the first file that I based my code on, and this was from the internet somewhere. And so they had one bank of ROM and then one bank of RAM. ROM, RAM, and then power of 2 ROMs, power of 2 RAMs, and then combine everything into main.gb. And this file was not compiling for me. And what I'm trying to get at is, what does this RAM bank have to do with this code, right? I don't understand why on this compiler line we're telling it about RAM at all. It makes sense to take the compiled assembly or machine code from tiles.c, put it into an object file, and that object file is going to be part of a bank. That makes sense. What does that have to do with RAM? Why are we combining RAM here? I feel like these three things should be entirely unnecessary, and then in your last line, you should tell GBDK about how many RAM banks you want. So that begs the question, why do you tell RAM and ROM at the same time when you're compiling a bank? That's what I'm confused about. So what I thought would happen is, take, for example, in my build script, in bank 2, I put game.c. And in game.c, I declare some variables here, I declare a variable there, and then in each of these files, for example, bricks, I also declare variables there. And they're all public global scope variables. So I would expect that maybe perhaps if you're building this bank, let's say it's this one, like let's say this is game.c, I would expect that then those variables that are defined in game.c would go into bank RAM 2. Right? Because why else would you tell it about a RAM bank when you're compiling a ROM bank? That's the discrepancy in my head that I really can't wrap my head around. If it's the case that you can just switch to a RAM bank and then access stuff via pointers, that makes sense to me. But then if you have something like this that's just declared, where does that go in memory, and how does that affect switching RAM banks? So are switching RAM banks only for using pointers, and you always have to, reference things by address? Or if you can use variable names, how do you know which variables go into which bank? And that's what I'm confused about, because for a ROM, it makes perfect sense. This code turns into assembly and goes into this bank. I understand what's inside that bank. For RAM banks, I have no idea why I'm telling it about a RAM bank when I'm compiling a ROM. And then also, I have no idea what goes into it or how to get stuff out of it. Like, this is completely foreign concept to me. Now, the other day, when I first posted, I had these statements still because I thought I needed them, because every example I looked at had them. Now I realize that I don't need them because I'm not actually using that RAM. And just by making stuff, constant, I can load it directly from ROM, which is fantastic and exactly what I wanted. But in the future, if I do need RAM, why do I tell it about RAM banks when I'm compiling ROM banks? And then once I have these RAM banks, how do I put stuff in them? How do I take stuff out of them? How do I know which variables that are declared go into them? That's what I'm confused about. I really don't understand that. That's my cognitive dissonance. How stuff goes into a bank and or a RAM bank, and how that I'm repeating myself at this point. I get why ROM goes in a ROM bank. I don't get why RAM has anything to do with compiling at all. So yeah, that's basically. Hopefully that explained what I was confused about a little bit better. Yeah, I don't need extra RAM right now, thank goodness. But I'm ambitious, so maybe in the future I will. Yeah, thank you. I work from home a lot. I do remote working, and I constantly record stuff and send it to my coworkers. I think it's a really good way to communicate, because sometimes, you can type a text post, but certain things. I mean, we're talking about stuff that's so abstract that it's it can get dicey when you're just dealing with text, and sometimes just actually going through the motion of compiling things and showing what's happening is really useful. So it's a skill I picked up from my job, and I really like it. But thank you guys again. I want to thank everybody here, because I was really frustrated. I actually didn't realize that there was still a community of people that are active. I'm surprised that a lot of this stuff comes from 1999, and a lot of these tools are so old. On the other hand, that's kind of good, because I got the tile designer and map builder to work on my friend's Mac, because she wanted to play with this stuff, and they work in Wine flawlessly. I mean, these are such like old Windows 98 programs that Wine has them locked down. They work perfectly on Wine for Mac. So that was actually a good thing. Yeah, but no, I'm surprised this community's been around so long, and I'm really happy that there's this board, and you guys were able to help me, because I've been Googling quite a lot, and I couldn't figure this out. And in the past 2 days, you guys have taught me quite a lot. So I'm really thankful for that. But yeah, I'll keep you guys updated as I progress. And hopefully I made my question about RAM a little bit more clear. Thankfully, I don't need RAM yet. But who knows about the future? This definitely won't be my last game, hopefully. So yeah, thank you guys again. And I'll keep you updated.